Hello, in this video we're going to cover how to deploy VM series from the Google Cloud Marketplace. So this video is going to cover how to deploy VM series to protect your Google Cloud deployment. Other videos will cover how Evident can be used to protect your Google Cloud deployment, or how to deploy traps for protecting endpoints like infrastructure VMs in Google Cloud. Here are some of the deployment scenarios for VM series to protect your Google Cloud deployments. This could include protecting hybrid cloud traffic coming from your on-prem environment into GCP, or segmenting between different VPCs inside Google Cloud, or using VM series as a perimeter firewall to protect inbound and outbound traffic flows for applications that are deployed in GCP. And finally, you can also use VM series as a global protect VPN gateway to secure remote and mobile users. So here's a typical deployment for a simple VM series setup, where VM series has got 4 interfaces in this example, where the first interface is for management traffic, ETH0. Second interface, ETH1, is a public facing one where internet facing traffic will come in. And then there are 2 private interfaces in this diagram, where ETH2 is connected to the web VPC and ETH3 is connected to the database VPC. So this shows you a basic simple deployment scenario. In the example that we will cover on launching for GCP, we will just use 3 interfaces, meaning management, public, and a private one. So before we begin, there are a couple of prerequisites you need to follow through on. First is you need to create 3 VPCs, one for each of the network interfaces to connect into. So management, untrust, and trust. You only need public IP on the management and the untrust for a simple demo setup. Any additional interfaces or VPCs that map to them are optional. You can add them later. What you can also optionally do is use a Google Cloud Storage bucket for creating bootstrap files for VM series, or you can swap the interface between management and untrust so that you can deploy it behind a Google Cloud Load Balancer. Documentation has a lot more details on it. Then you also need to prepare the SSH key you're going to use to configure your VM series firewall. There is no default password set for the firewall for security reasons. And then finally, during the deployment steps, we will go ahead and configure these things. So first is selecting the type of the license we are going to use. So either it's a bring your own license or a VM series ELA, or the 2 pay-as-you-go options, bundle 1 or bundle 2. I'll cover these in detail in a minute. Then selecting the size of the VM to match the type of license you're going to use. And then finally, mapping the interfaces to the different VPCs we already pre-created. One additional nuance is, to protect the management interface from getting attacks from the open internet, we will set a GCP firewall rule as part of the deployment itself to protect that NIC. Now let's look at the different licensing options really quickly. You can look at online documentation for more. So the first is the bring your own license option. This lets you use any of the traditional purchasing process, and then you can use specific VM series firewall models combined with these bundle offerings of subscriptions of security. Okay. Next, you can use the pay-as-you-go options. This includes just what is described as bundle 1, which uses the VM 300 with threat prevention and premium support included. Or you can choose bundle 2, which uses the VM 300 model with threat prevention, URL filtering, wildfire, and premium support. And finally, there's the option of VM series ELA, which is just a licensing model that uses the BYOL SKU that is listed in the marketplace. Okay, so these are 3 choices. Now, in terms of selecting the size of the Google Cloud machine, based on the license type, you can choose some of these specific models. For simplicity, we've highlighted the recommended machine types. So in this case, for VM 300, N1 Standard 4, which has 4 cores, 15 gigabytes of memory, and 4 interfaces, is kind of the right size. Similarly, we've shown sizes for the 8-core license, VM 500, and the 16 core license, which is VM 700, where we've shown the recommended sizes. For our example, I'm going to use this because it's the simplest model that fits most of the needs. Okay, and then there are some after deployment steps. So that said, let's go and look at the setup. So here, if I go to my VPC in the GCP console, I've created 3 VPCs: the management network, the trust network, and the untrust. So each of these have subnets created under them where the interfaces will connect into. So 10.0.10.5.0 is my management, 10.5.1 is my untrust, and then 10.5.2 is my trust network, which is on the private side. So that's the VPC setup. Now let's go ahead and go into sort of a deployment scenario. Oops. Okay. So I go to Google Cloud Marketplace. You can find it in the console under Marketplace, and you can search for Palo Alto Networks, and you will see the 3 SKUs I mentioned. So I'm going to go pick bundle 1, and then I'm going to say launch and compute engine. So this brings up VM. I provided a name. I select, okay, seems like I already have VM of the same name. So then I go and select the region where I had created my networks. I choose US East 1 because that's where my VPCs had been created. The default we've set is for 4 CPUs because that's perfect for the VM series bundle 1, which is a VM 300 license. I'm not using bootstrap in this setup or interface swap. Next, we come to providing the SSH key. So the SSH key must be in this specific format. So you can go to your CLI and find out your SSH key if you've pre-created it. So I am just gonna go ahead and show you my private public SSH key, and I would just simply grab this piece. Just this much is required. The username does not matter because the VM is always configured with admin as the username. So I go ahead and put the key value here. Then we scroll down and come to the interface section where we map the interfaces to the VPCs. So here's my management, which is 80. And so we have enabled a public IP, which is an external IP in Google terminology. Then we enable the GCP firewall rule to make sure that the management interface is only locked to our user interface. Next, we now need to provide the IP address for our local IP. So I'm just going to say, what's my IP, and let sort of Google find out and tell me my IP. And I take that and I provide that here. And that means traffic only coming from this IP will be allowed to come to the management interface. So if you switch your networks, for example, between home and office and so on, you have to go back to the GCP firewall rule and add your IP into that. Next, we come to the untrust interface. So I'm going to go and select the untrust VPC I had created. You can see that I have only one subnet in there. So Google's automatically pre-selected that subnet. Then I go and select my trust VPC, and then it's also pre-selected my trust subnet. If you had more subnets, you'd be able to select them. So that is sort of the basic information that is needed to deploy VM series now. As I mentioned, you have the option to add additional interfaces up to a total of 8 interfaces, which means you can add 5 more interfaces since we already did 3. So I go ahead and click deploy now, and that starts the deployment process. So this will take about 5 minutes. We can come back and check on this in a couple of minutes and see how the progress is there. Meanwhile, let me walk you through the remainder of the steps of what's required after deployment finishes. So once the firewall is deployed, as I mentioned, there is no default password that is in the firewall. It only uses the SSH key that you provided to configure it. So then we will need to connect into the firewall via SSH using the private key, and then we will configure a password so that we can log in via the web interface in the firewall. So that's sort of the basic setup that's needed to deploy firewall. Once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and enable dhcp on both the interfaces. The the ETH1 and ETH2, which are the data plane interfaces, where ETH1 maps to untrust and ETH2 maps to the trust zone. And then we will write a simple firewall policy that allows traffic between untrust to trust zones. So this is a quick overview, and in a couple of minutes I'll go through the basic setup. But before I go further, I also want to highlight that there are several templates that are available as example templates that are completely pre-created, where, for example, if I go back to the setup, there's a 2-tier example that we mentioned there. We create the web server VPC, the database VPC, and we deploy example VMs, where, for example, a WordPress server and a MySQL database that supports that WordPress are pre-created, and then entire setup is completely scripted. So that way you can deploy the stack and play around with it. So that template and several other templates are available via this live.paloaltonetworks.com/cloud template, and then you go look at the Google Cloud section. So while that's going on, we can come back to look at the Google console to see the progress of our deployment. You can see that it has given us some information, and so VM series has been deployed. Now it's booting up, it's loading the PanOS software and so on. So to take a quick look, if I click on the HTTPS link for the ETH0, the management interface, you can see that it's trying to load, which means the OS is still in the process of coming up. So while it's coming up, let me show you the cloud templates page I mentioned. So there are sample templates available here. So if you go to the Google Cloud section, you can see the 2-tier template. There's a normal GCP deployment manager template for this. There's also a Terraform version of the same template. Then there are several other templates that, for example, build load balancer sandwich architecture, or load balancer sandwich where the application tier at the bottom is a GKE stack of applications for container-based deployments. So these are sort of typical setups. So for example, I'm going to go and click on the 2-tier to show you what's there in GitHub. So it has a link here, click on it, and it takes me to the GitHub page for this template. So you can see that it's got this kind of a setup where there's a management interface, an untrust, there's a web, and a database. And then you can download the deployment guide, and it'll walk you through all the steps on how to deploy this template. So these are traditional Google Cloud Deployment Manager YAML templates that deploy this. So you can obviously play with this and customize this to what you're trying to do. So let's go back and look at it. So the VM is still in the process of coming up. So while we wait for it, let's get ready so that once we are ready to connect, we will be able to do so. So here I'm going to grab the management interfaces public IP, and I'm going to go prep my CLI. So what we need to do is, let me just show you this list of commands we're going to run through. So we already used the SSH key to deploy the firewall. Then we're going to log into the firewall. So in this case, I'm going to replace this with my management interface IP. So I do SSH-I. I give it the private keys needed, because now you're connecting into the firewall, and then admin at the public IP. That's the command. So let me grab that. Okay, so now I'm kind of ready, and I'm just going to leave it on the firewall. I'm not going to run the command yet. Let me go back and check if the firewall is still now completely deployed. So you can see that the firewall is deployed. The firewalls are by default built with a self-signed certificate. So Google is obviously going to make sure that you're connecting to the right place. Okay, so let me go back and load again, and you can see that the web UI has come up now. Okay, so that means that the firewall is fully up and running, and then now we should be able to connect in via SSH. So I go in there and I enter a command, and it seems like I typed something strange. So, okay, let me try again. Seems like I'm making some typing mistakes. Okay, so firewall connection opens up, and the SSH key prompt comes up. In my case, my SSH key is configured with a password. So this is just the SSH key password. It's not the firewall's password, right? We've logged into the firewall plainly with the SSH key we had provided. So now we're going to go into the firewall and run the configure command, and then now we're going to set up the password. So the command is set mgt. By the way, you can hit tab after typing a couple of characters and it'll do autocomplete. Set mgd configure users admin and then password. So this is going to now let me configure the password, and I've configured the password. Obviously you should make sure that you create a complex enough password so that in case your management interface is accidentally exposed to the internet, you don't get hacked, because there's always people trying to brute force VMs in the cloud. So now that I've issued a commit, it's going to save that configuration and we're done. So I can exit out of the config mode. So if I go back to the firewall, I can now type in admin and the password I just gave, and then I'm logged in. Excellent. Okay, so it's going to log me in, and then I'm going to show you some of the basic config steps to configure. So as I mentioned, we're going to enable dhcp and enable a simple security policy. Okay, so we've logged into the firewall, and close this guy. So you can see some of the basic information. This is the management's private IP. CPU ID says I'm deployed from Google Cloud, and it's a VM300 type license. Okay, so let's go and do the network tab and enable DHCP on E11. This is a layer 3 interface, and we're going to go to IPv4, enable DHCP, and then we also need to enable a virtual router so that it allows traffic to flow between trust and untrust based on policy. So this is E11, so this is going to be an untrust. So I'm going to create a new zone for untrust, meaning traffic coming from the internet side. That's done. Okay, then I go to the second interface and again configure it as layer 3, and then enable DHCP, and then enable the virtual router and add the trust zone for the private side of their network. So that's done. Okay, that, and then I go to a commit. So what's that gonna do is that obviously it sets the configuration of the firewall, and then DHCP will be activated on the firewall's interfaces, and now you have a fully running active firewall that is connecting across 3 VPCs: management, trust, and untrust. Okay, so I've got that, and that means that they're active. I can quickly click here, and you can see that it's going through DHCP to grab an IP address. So essentially, at this point, if I come back and show you the diagram, in my case, I just use 3 interfaces. This 4th interface does not exist, but now public-facing traffic that comes from the internet can connect in, and if you have a web server behind here, you can now write a security policy that goes across these 2 zones. For example, I go back here and I can write a security policy that says allow inbound, for example, and I say source is going to be the untrust, so coming from the outside, and then the destination is on the trust side. And for applications, for the moment, as a sample, I'm saying allow. You of course wouldn't do this in the real world, and in just a sample policy, I'm also doing logging of session start so that you can see some traffic coming in when you have actual traffic coming in from the internet. So I commit, and that creates a very, very simple baseline policy just for POC type, testing. So now that the firewall's created, is exposed, if you have any traffic flowing through, you would actually see it in the monitor tab. So that sort of concludes the setup. Let me come back to the Google Cloud Console and mention one more thing. I mentioned the source IP that you would use to block management interface access, but if you do switch your IP addresses, and you can't get in, then here's what you do. You go to the firewall in the Google Cloud Console, you go down to the interfaces, so next 0 is management, go click on it, and if you go to the firewall section, you can see it says firewall rules allowed source IP, and you can see that I've got 2 IP addresses that I have pre-added. In this case, this is the one that I would have provided in the console, and the second IP is the one that I had also separately set up. So these are the 2 IPs from which traffic can come in. But if I want to change it, I can click here and edit to add or remove any more sources from which management traffic is going to come in for the firewall. So as a quick summary, I want to leave you with a couple of things you can look at. For more information just on overall security features of VM-Series, go to googlecloud.paloaltonetworks.com. All the templates I mentioned are available at live.paloaltonetworks.com/cloud template. And then documentation, you can just look through our documentation portal to get more information on the features I mentioned. For example, like bootstrapping and so on, or how to deploy VM-Series behind a load balancer sandwich. That concludes this setup.